Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted to the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary and social issues, all at a digestible level. My name is Sarah Srivastava, and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. Andrew Richmond, a postdoctoral associate in the EMRG lab at the Rotman Institute at University of Western Ontario. Hi, Dr. Richmond. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm really excited for the discussion that we're about to have today, especially because I think the topic is really, really interesting and a lot of new developments in the field for sure too. But first, I just wanted to thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussion, this is just like an intro question that I ask all my guests, and I wanted to ask you as well. How did you get into philosophy? What stood out to you? Was it introduced to you at an early age, or was it something that you learned in college? What was your story into philosophy?
Yeah, I really got into it in college. I went to college thinking I was going to double major in philosophy and psychology. And intro to psychology just wasn't that interesting to me. And intro to philosophy was. I had a really great professor, Paul Viminitz at the University of Lethbridge, who I don't know, just made philosophical questions really come alive. And then over the next couple of years, I had really fantastic teachers. Kent Peacock and Trudy Govier, especially at the University of Lethbridge. I actually sort of got into the reason I went to university thinking that I would major in philosophy was that I had a really poor understanding of what philosophy was. And for the previous couple years, I'd been like devouring the sort of like new atheist Hitchens and Dawkins books and stuff like that. And I loved it. And I thought that's what philosophy was. And then I realized it was a lot more than that over the next few years. So thankfully, I realized it was a lot more than that. But for whatever reason, that was the hook that got me in. And then all of those fantastic professors showed me the depth of it beyond all that stuff.
And then I wanted to ask you, like in colleges, like did you have a specific interest, like of like what type of philosophy? Because you did learn like it's a lot more than what you just originally thought. Was that
Yeah.
like something you started like expanding on like different things? Is that something you like about philosophy, that there's so many things that you can explore, or like what kind of fields interested you the most?
Yeah, I mean, so what the one thing I really like about it is the diversity, that there's so many different things you can do. It was very strange, but in my last year of high school, we had a job shadow program where you could go and follow someone around on their job. And I'm the only person I know who job shadowed a philosophy professor. Very strange experience. It was actually Trudy Govier. She was great and really nice. And what she said she loved about philosophy was that you could do so many things. You could one semester be studying, thinkers from the 17th century, and then the next semester you're studying current issues in biology. So that is kind of what I love about it. I got into it through the philosophy of religion, but I love the huge gamut of things that you can study as a philosopher.
Right, that makes sense. And I guess now we can go like maybe a little bit more into your research today, which is around like computation and the philosophy of cognitive science. But before we talk about that, I think it's kind of important to talk about like what cognitive science is, and how do philosophers play a role in it? Because it literally has the word science attached to it, so you'd imagine that there'd be scientists there. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, like, what is cognitive science? How do philosophers play a role in it? And then, like, what are the types of questions that philosophers of cognitive science are kind of interested in?
Yeah. So cognitive science very broadly just tries to understand the mind and how it works. That itself doesn't really clarify things, because what's the mind and what is this question about how it works? But cognitive scientists want to understand how we perceive, how we understand, how we navigate, how we remember, how we reason. And it's pretty much anything that we do that seems to involve intelligence, reason, the kind of things we typically think of as the mind. Anything like that is pretty much up for grabs in cognitive science. And so it does that by thinking about, first of all, the things we can do, like navigate and perceive and whatever, and then the resources we have for doing them, both in the world and famously in our brains, right? And it kind of wants to reverse engineer our cognitive capacities, our ability to navigate, our ability to perceive, to remember. So philosophy comes into it in a sort of strange way. First of all, because a lot of the resources that we use to perceive and navigate and remember and so on are in the brain, neuroscience, very obviously a part of cognitive science. Lots of these resources have to do with the more abstract organization of organisms like us that pick up information from their environment and do things with it, and that's what psychology studies. Computer science builds systems that do things like perceive and navigate and so on. So any field that studies any of these aspects of cognition sort of gets to be a part of cognitive science. And so it's not just those fields, it's anthropology studies cognition in its social and environmental cultural context, linguistics, political science study types of decision and types of ability, economics studies types of decision. Philosophy studies cognition too, in a sort of different way from these other fields, but like ancient philosophers had theories of how we perceive. Aristotle had this really fascinating theory of vision, theories of how we know things, how we can know things about the world. And later philosophers like Locke and Berkeley and Hume were studying how we reason and how the mind works. So philosophy is one of those fields that make up cognitive science, but you're right that it's a sort of outlier because it studies them in a sort of different way. Philosophers are especially concerned with the kind of implications that cognition has for deep philosophical problems. So if you take like Descartes, he had a theory of cognition, but he was really interested in the consequences of that theory for our knowledge of the external world and skepticism, and for things about our relationship to God and stuff like that. So philosophers have this sort of role as we do study cognition, but we have these kind of interests that pulls us away from the scientific aspects of it in some ways, but not in other ways. Again, a lot of philosophers are just concerned with how cognition works. The second way that philosophy comes into the picture is that we study science, right? So science is one of the most important and impressive things human beings do. And it's one of the most complicated and interesting ways that we generate knowledge about the world. Philosophers ask all kinds of questions about that, right? How does science generate knowledge? Is it reliable in the way it generates knowledge? What distinguishes science or good science from pseudoscience or bad science or conspiracy theorizing? How do scientific theories work? How do scientific models work? And so we ask those questions about science in general and about cognitive science in particular, along with any other science. And that actually gives us a very cool position in cognitive science, where we are a little bit on the outside because we're not scientists, but we have a very sort of reflective position. So we're really well positioned to think about cognitive science and its theories and how its theories work. And you can often say really interesting things about the brain and about our understanding of the brain by stepping back and thinking about what we're trying to do when we understand the brain, what our theories are supposed to be doing and stuff like that.
So is it more of like a relationship where the scientist provides kind of the research or the basis for philosophical theories to arise? Or is it vice versa, where philosophy is trying to explain science and like what those discoveries mean?
I think it's both. So definitely the philosophers trying to explain what scientific discoveries mean is a huge thing. Philosophers are still really interested in looking at like what's our scientific understanding of the brain and what does that tell us about our ability to like connect to the external world and our skepticism about the other world. What does that tell us about how we know other people's minds and things like that? Philosophers are still really interested in doing that. But the other direction is there too. Like a lot of contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science is an elaboration of British empiricist philosophy of mind. So Jerry Fodor has this, a famous philosopher of mind, has this book that just tries to make the case that contemporary cognitive science is essentially David Hume with better experiments. So the influence goes in the other way too.
Okay, I think like that, I kind of understand like where, philosophy can explain science, but I guess the other aspect of it is also kind of interesting. Because oftentimes it's like, like there's like a really big difference between philosophy and science, right? But then I guess here you can see that there's actually a lot of synergy between the two as well, which is really interesting to note. But I guess before we get any further, there's like a few terms being like tossed around. So there's the brain and there's the mind. What exactly is the distinction between these two? Because oftentimes, at least for me, when I'm thinking about like the mind or like the brain, I use them almost synonymously. But I understand that there is probably a big difference between the two and how they're used in philosophy, and even in cognitive science as a whole. So, from my understanding, it's like the brain is more like the actual like what's there, the scientific aspect of it as well, like what that's what science is studying, and then philosophy is correlated more on like the mind and like research of the mind. Could you kind of
Yeah.
explain on this or elaborate on this and like what that difference is?
Yeah, so the difference is a subject of huge debate. Some people think they are just the same thing. The mind is the brain, and that's all there is to say. One thing cognitive scientists often say that is helpful. There's a slogan: "The mind is what the brain does." So the brain's a hunk of stuff. It's like it's grayish goo, right? Very complex and structured, but it's just a hunk of stuff. What it does is lets us perceive. It lets us interact with our environment. It lets us reach out, and even just as simple as reaching out and grasping things. It lets us learn about the environment and engage with each other. So all of these things that we have a really long history of thinking about, perception and reasoning and our engagement with the world, or the way we're able to engage with the world, this is what people usually mean by the mind. The brain, and more generally the nervous system and the physical organism, is what lets you do all that stuff. That's going to be, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who disagree with that answer. I'm trying to stay as like neutral as I can, but yeah, we often treat them as essentially the same thing. You see a lot of people say, like, when they're talking about the mind or the brain, they'll call it the mind/brain. So we tend to treat them as roughly the same thing.
Okay, I mean, I think maybe like in more so in like maybe consciousness, like philosophy, there is a big distinction between the two. But we'll get into that a little bit. But I just wanted to ask like about your paper, which is titled "How Computation Explains." And so now we're entering like the domain of like how computation affects kind of like the brain or like slash the mind, and like what that really means. So in order to like understand that, we need to understand what computation is. So could you explain what computation is, and then also explain why understanding computation is necessary to understand the brain?
Yeah. So computation is very, very hard to define. Um, Abstract computation is actually pretty easy to define, or at least most of the work defining it has been done in the 20th century by some brilliant mathematicians. By abstract computation, I mean the like mathematical definition of computation. So there's a certain class of mathematical functions that are computable, it's called. Just the same way that there are mathematical objects that are squares because they have all of their points in a certain organization, or mathematical objects that are circles because they have every point is equidistant from the center. Or the same distance from the center. A certain class of mathematical functions are computable because the really essential part of the definition is you can get from the start of the function to the end, from the input to the output, by what's called an effective algorithm, which is just a finite series of steps that you can specify so that you don't have to make any judgment in figuring out what each step does. Like, x plus 1 is a step that you don't have to apply any judgment to figure out what the answer is, right? If your input is 5, 5 plus 1 is 6. Add enough baking soda so that the cake rises. That's not a step that you can do without judgment, right? It requires a lot of contribution by you. So if you can compute a function by steps that don't require any human judgment, that is the main part of the definition that makes a function computable. The other aspect of computation is physical. So it's not just a set of functions, right? X plus 1 or x divided by 2 or something more complicated. It's the fact that your computer is a hunk of stuff that computes. So what's interesting there is the relationship between the computer and these functions. right? What makes it the case that the computer is actually computing something? Or that the brain is, or that your calculator is, or whatever. And I don't actually have an answer to that. There are a lot, you can get a long way thinking about examples. So your laptop, your phone, your calculator, these are all things that compute. The other example that's really helpful is people. And not just people's brains, I mean people's jobs, right? The word computer was originally a job description. The word computer originally meant people who actually come in and work out formulas by hand for a lot of different reasons, especially to do with navigation and astronomy. It was useful to have big tables that would tell you like where a particular planet would be at this point in time from this location. And to generate those tables, you needed people to come in and do all of the mathematical derivation that tells you where the sun is going to be from that point and from so on. And those people were called computers. They had formulas so that they could come up with the answers or entries in these tables. And then sometime in the 20th century, we started to extend the word to other things, to like systems that we created. Systems that were similar to these human computers in a way, systems that could just follow a mathematical formula. And that it didn't require a lot of like judgment to figure out how to follow it. And what all these things have in common, both the people computers and the devices we have, are, I think, three essential things. So there's a definable range of inputs they can have. There's a series or a set of physical operations they can perform on the inputs. And there's a set of outputs that generates. That doesn't quite answer the question, because you're going to naturally ask, is anything that can do that computing? Is anything that has inputs, physical operations, and outputs computing? Because my stove has inputs, raw food, operations, producing heat, and an output, which is cooked food. And we probably don't want to say the stove computes. The thing is, that's not a huge deal if we're using computation like we use it in cognitive science. So in cognitive science, we think about the brain as a computer, or we think about it as computing in order to think about its inputs, its operations, and its outputs. And that's a really natural way to think about a lot of our capacities. Like if you just think about your ability to catch a ball, right? Input is visual, seeing where the ball is. The operations are the ones that take that visual input and help you move your hand based on it. And the output is putting your hand at a location where the ball is going to hit it. Those are the kind of things we want to explain in cognitive science usually. So we need computation to understand the brain because in order to even frame our questions about the brain, we're already thinking of them in terms of computation, right? Our questions about the brain are exactly questions about what kind of operations it can do to produce outputs from inputs. There is a pretty big caveat there, which is that definition of computation is contentious. And if you have a more informative definition of computation, if you think computation is something more specific, like to compute, something has to be doing something like an old-fashioned computer program does, then the question of whether cognitive science should think of the brain as computing gets a lot more complicated, because classical computers or computer programs use discrete symbols like variables for numbers and names for locations in the computer's register. They store those symbols in a memory that is separate from the computer's other parts and that the computer has to query anytime it needs to recall something from memory. They tend to take inputs and come up with an output before then going back to take another input. So it's like input, bunch of operations, produce an output, find another input. If you think any of those aren't descriptions of the brain, then you're going to say, well, it's not a computer in that sense. in this classical sense of computation. And a lot of the debate in cognitive science is over whether the brain is a computer in that sense or in some more sophisticated sense. Very few people, I think, in cognitive science don't think that the brain is a computer in this very general sense. But there's a ton of debate about what exact sense it's a computer, or in what exact sense it's a computer.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And obviously, I feel like there's like an infinite amount of cases that people can use to like disprove a definition, but that might be the challenge that philosophers might have to like actually define it. Because like in my mind, it seems like computation is like really simple to grasp, but at the same time, it's because I've been doing computational like things for such a long period of time. So like my normal understanding of computation is like tuned into my own experiences, which might be different from someone else's. And so that leads me to my next question, which is like, are you born with skills to like compute? Like, is that something that babies are innately born with? And then my second question, like to add on to that, would be, are animals able to compute? Are animals also like having computers as their brains?
Um, yeah, I think the answer's got to be yes in at least this way. Like babies obviously aren't born with the ability to sit down at a computer and type out a program or something like that, right? They're not born with a conception of computation or any really complicated computational abilities in their behavior, but they're at least able to learn. And that is, on this really minimal definition of computation, that's going to look a lot like computation. They're able to take input, use procedures that generate an output. If the output was wrong, or if the output got their hand burnt or something, they realize they shouldn't have reached there. And now they revise the procedures so that next time they give a different output. We're thinking about that computationally in this minimal sense. Same with animals. Are they able to compute in a more robust way? I don't think so. I don't think they're computers in the sense of like an old-fashioned computer program or something like that. I don't think they, or even we, have a separate part of the brain that stores memory that the rest of the brain needs to query and pull information from. I don't think that's how memory works. I think most of cognition doesn't use discrete symbols. I don't think cognition happens in the kind of steps that classical computation happens. So if you think about the way you, even just think about the way you catch a ball, it's not like you get the information, you do the computations, you put your hand here and you see if you were right. You're looking at the ball the whole time and you're taking in new information about it. So it's not just input operations output, it's input coming in continuously and you're doing new things with the input the whole time. So it doesn't look like classical computation, but it does look like computation in this very minimal sense.
Okay, and then I guess like same thing for animals then, right? Would they also be able to do or like have computation? And then also just because we're talking about this in like the kind of context of minimal and like non-minimal, is it like a spectrum where you have like a good versus like a bad computation? Yeah, just like are those like things that exist?
Uh, yeah, so for animals, I think I probably want to say the same thing as for babies. Like they also can't sit down at a computer and write code or something like that. They're not behaviorally able to do computation the way we are. That's a really sophisticated skill, but is just, are their brains and their nervous systems and their organisms more broadly doing computation? Well, yeah, or at least that's the way it makes sense to think of them for the purposes of doing cognitive science, right? It makes sense to think of them as having a set of operations that they perform on inputs to generate outputs. What was the second question? Sorry, I'm blanking.
If there's a spectrum of good versus bad computation.
Yeah, okay, so there's definitely a spectrum of definitions. Like you might have my definition, anything that sort of does operations on input to produce output, that's computation, fine. Or you might have a really strict definition that says to be computation, something has to do operations that involve discrete symbols, not continuous values. It has to store those symbols in a memory, et cetera, et cetera. And you might have all kinds of things in between, or just different definitions of computation, right? Maybe to compute, something has to do what neural networks do. That would be a different definition. As to whether things can do good or bad computations, I think like they can do, they can miscompute, they can compute wrong. So if there's like an electrical problem in your calculator, you type 5 plus 5 and it outputs 1 instead of 10, it's miscomputed. So in that sense, there are bad computations.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And maybe like also kind of like in like neural networks, like how like there's a loss function kind of to evaluate how the way in which you responded to certain things. So maybe that could contribute to like being in a spectrum of like maybe there's not a spectrum of like versus like good or bad computation, but rather the result could be applied to kind of like see how that computational skill or whatever algorithm or kind of steps were taken was the correct approach, or how it like can be better, I guess.
Yeah,
um
you can have the wrong, like a loss function that's just doesn't help the neural network learn something, or makes it learn a lot slower. Yeah. Yeah, so there can
right.
be computations that are a lot worse for achieving some goal or for learning something. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess like because we're kind of talking about, I mean, like neural networks for sure, like emerging, and there's kind of a lot of questions around those systems, those AI systems. And so I guess this question here is kind of talking about consciousness, and like the relationship between computation and consciousness.
Yeah.
Is consciousness an emergent property of certain computational processes? And how does the nature of computation affect our understanding of consciousness without getting like super deep into like consciousness theory, because that could be like in a separate podcast for sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so this is like maybe the hardest question you could ask. Uh, I have no idea what consciousness is. Um, the way I described my view of computation is that it's just sort of a way we think of the brain, right? There's nothing it is to be a computer that like my laptop satisfies and my stove doesn't. Uh, Computation is just a way that we think about things to either engineer them or to build models of them and reverse engineer them like we want to do with the brain. If that's right, it's hard to say that consciousness is, or consciousness emerges from computation. Because if you want to know whether something's conscious, you you need to look at whether it meets the criteria for being conscious. And if the criteria are that it computes, well, I've just said that there's really no such thing as that makes something compute, right? So on my view, computation is a bad place to look for what grounds consciousness. If I'm wrong about computation, then there is something it is to compute, that the brain meets that criteria, my laptop meets that criteria, my stove doesn't. And if computing is what supports cognition, and if consciousness comes along with cognition, then yeah, computation is a really good place to look for the source of cognition, sorry, for the source of consciousness. But you get really weird and really fun puzzles if you go that way. So it's a ridiculous thought experiment, but imagine you just figured out what computation your nervous system was doing, or what set of computations. And remember that computations can be done and originally were done by groups of people, each working out a formula and passing on the result. Okay, so now get a big group of people, set them up to each do a part of the computation that all of your neurons together are doing. And they each do their bit of the computation, they pass the result on to someone else, they take that input, do their bit of the computation on it, pass it on to someone else, organize them so that they're doing the same computation as the brain. If consciousness emerges from computation, that group of people should be conscious in the same way that I'm conscious, right? Not each individually, but the group itself should be conscious. And you can do this with not people, but just set up like carrier pigeons or water pipes or something that implement a computation instead of the electrical system that does it in the computer. There are a lot of different things you can say about this, but it's a really puzzling result. If you have to say, oh no, is this group of people, is this system of carrier pigeons conscious? So you could do a couple things. You could tighten the definition of computation, like we've talked about. So if you have a more restrictive definition of computation that excludes my stove, maybe it's also going to exclude that group of people and the water pipes and the carrier pigeons. Or you might just think that consciousness doesn't emerge from computation, it emerges from something else, like your abilities to interact with your environment or something like that is maybe one suggestion you would see in philosophy. Or you can, and it's popular in work on consciousness to just get really radical and really wild. So the two ends of that spectrum, you could think that consciousness doesn't emerge from anything. It's the most basic thing in the universe. Everything is a little bit conscious, and the consciousness we experience is just the collected bits of consciousness of all of our parts. Or you could think there's no such thing as consciousness, right? That we certainly experience the world, but when we say, oh, there's this property, consciousness, that I have when I'm experiencing the world, and there's a way to define that property, maybe that's mistaken. So there are a lot of ways you can go with this. And I guess this is probably, since you interview philosophers, you get this answer a lot, but I have no idea. I have no idea what's the correct theory of consciousness. I suspect it's not a computational theory, but I could very well be wrong.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess like just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, it's not just that Dr. Richmond doesn't know, it's that like no one knows, like no one really knows what
Yeah.
consciousness is yet. So like it makes sense for there not to be kind of like a coherent answer as to what that could look like. I was just thinking like, I mean, I guess the thought experiment shows that my line of reasoning for why computation could be related to consciousness is kind of flawed in a sense, because it could, because then that would technically mean that there would be like a group of individuals who would be conscious, or anyone could be conscious if they replicate the same systems that the brain is doing,
And
which
that
seems
doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. Like the consciousness is where you go if you want to have radical theories. So if you want to say
okay.
groups of people, groups of carrier pigeons are consciousness, or sorry, are conscious. This is, yeah, that's a view. We know so little about consciousness that that's a pretty acceptable idea to pursue. It might sound crazy, but it's an idea. It's worth pursuing. It's worth figuring out, even if it's wrong. Figuring out exactly why it's wrong would help the field of consciousness studies a lot.
And that is the benefit of philosophy, because you're able to like delve into a lot of these different things. So like that's just like a reason as to why philosophy is really really interesting. But I want to get into kind of like one of your other papers titled computational externalism, which honestly seems pretty interesting. But can you explain a little bit about what this is, so there's some background information to work with here?
Yeah, so I've actually struggled to explain this before. I think the way I'm tempted to put it now is that there's a trend in cognitive science and the philosophy of cognitive science of thinking about the brain as sort of self-contained. And the idea is that when we try to understand the brain, we can pretty easily separate it from its environment, right? Here's the brain, there's the environment. They interact, obviously, and that's one of the things that cognitive science studies, but they interact like a bowling ball interacts with bowling pins, right? They're separable things that bump into each other in certain more or less complicated ways. Another way of putting that is to think about the brain and the bowling ball and their physical structure, right? The bowling ball, if you consider it in isolation from everything else, just consider the bowling ball. It has a certain physical structure, right? And same with the brain, right? If you actually took the brain out and put it in a jar with nothing else, there would be a physical structure in that jar. And if you think about the brain in isolation from everything else, there's a physical structure that you're thinking about. So some properties are like that. Some properties things have even if you consider them in isolation. Other properties, they don't. So the bowling ball has a certain mass, which is just sort of the amount of material in it, but it doesn't have a weight considered in isolation, right? Weight depends on something's mass and the amount of gravity being applied to it. So famously, you weigh less on the moon than you weigh on Earth. So the bowling ball considered in isolation has mass, it doesn't have weight. And I think the brain's computational structure is more like weight than mass. I think that the brain's computational structure is one of those properties that goes away when you take it in isolation from the environment, like weight, and not like mass or not like physical structure. So the argument is sort of complicated, and it runs through a bunch of results in computer vision and evolutionary biology. But the short version is something like this. The brain's computational structure is just part of its physical structure, right? It's not like a non-physical thing in the brain. It's just that some of the neurons and some of the connections in the brain are computing. For example, the ones in the retina that determine what color something is, those are doing computations over other cells in the retina. But the parts of the brain that just insulate other neurons are not doing computation, right? Insulation isn't computation. So some parts of the brain's physical structure rise to the level of computation, and some don't. My point is that which parts of physical structure rise to the level of computation actually depends on the environment, the way that weight depends on gravity. And especially, it depends on the kind of problems that we think the organism is solving in its environment. So if I was right before, computational thinking is a way of explaining the brain's relationship to its environment, then its relationships to environment, what relationships it has and which ones we want to explain, are what determine which explanation is appropriate. And that's what determines which physical structures we're going to be describing as computational.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess like just because there's a lot of different definitions of environment. So I'm thinking right now, like, is like, does culture or like social kind of circles or your social network or like kind of just politics as a whole, can those influence computation as a whole? So like think about like maybe like racism or other things that exist. Do those actually influence computation as a whole, or is that like some other alternate bias that occurs from the brain?
No, I think they do. I think the your social situation, your culture, your political environment are your environment in the same way that your physical environment and the objects you're surrounded with and the surfaces you see are your environment. I think all of these things are parts of the world that you have to interact with, and that we give computational theories to explain how you interact with them. And so again, when we give those computational theories, we're like lifting some parts of the brain up to the level of computation. I mean, there's a ton of room for bias and various kinds of discrimination to interfere with computation in the case of neural networks as well, and AI, which is another interesting thing that I don't know, your call, we don't have to get into it, but that's another way that you can have these social structures and political structures, and especially biases, work their way in to affect something's computational structure.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on like that last point? Because I know like those things do exist in terms of computation, like computational models that we've built. Like because again, like if the data that these sort of models, these AI models are training off of, these artificially intelligent models are training off of, is necessarily problematic in terms of that it has biased data, then the model itself is also going to be relevantly like biased, right? Because that's what it's training off of. But I'm talking like maybe like in terms of our brain, like is there ways in which our computation, like the way it works in our brain, evolves over a period of time? Like does it change over a period of time? And then like obviously there's the alternate question. So that's the main question, right? Can it change over a period of time? And does it? And then second would be like, are societal factors and like culture an influence that could change different computations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes. And I think it's actually for exactly the same reason as it is with AI, right? Because AI learns by being presented with a huge amount of data. And if that data is biased, the AI is going to become biased. So for a recent example, in these image generation AIs like DALL-E 2, if you ask it for a picture of a doctor, it's going to give you a picture of a man. And if you ask it for a picture of a nurse, it's going to give you a picture of a woman. If you ask it for a set of pictures, actually, like 10 doctors, it's going to give you 10 pictures of men. And the reason is that the data it's fed on is produced by us. And we tend to picture doctors as men, and we tend to picture nurses as women. So it's just learning that bias. It's also doing a couple other really nefarious things. Like So for one thing, it might not just be learning biases in the world. It might be that our collection procedures, the way we collect the data, is bad. So if I collect data on for a facial recognition software, and I collect it, just by taking images of undergrads at my university, if my university is a very exclusive institution or if it's in a very white place, the image generation, or sorry, the face recognition software is going to get really good at discriminating when something is a white face versus not a face. And this actually happened. I think Timnit Gebru, if people know her, has a paper and some articles on this, some popular articles. But I believe it was one of her students couldn't figure out why her face recognition software on her iPhone never understood that she was looking at it, never understood that it was being presented with a face. And it turned out because it was just trained on a bunch of white faces. So it's not just data bias. It's not just that the world is biased. It's that the way we collect data is biased. And if the network, it can even be a function of how the network learns that it amplifies biases. So if 90%, if 9 out of 10 pictures of doctors in the database are men, and you ask the DALL-E 2 to create 10 images of doctors, what it's going to do is create 10 images that are as likely as possible to be classified as doctors. And it's going to do that individually. It's going to create the first one, and what's it going to do? It's going to create a man, because that's in its training data. And then it's going to create the second one, and exactly the same reasoning applies. So instead of 9 men and 1 woman, it's going to create 10 men, because it's just doing this individually on each one. So now it's actually amplifying the bias. All of these things, I think, are pretty reasonably applied to the brain and to human beings as well. Like, we learn from a biased world. Instead of sampling data from particular locations like a computer program does, we live in particular locations and in particular social settings where we're getting biased data, or we're sampling from a biased portion of the world. We are learning with all kinds of intentions to be accurate, but in situations and with learning methods where maybe that accuracy comes at the cost of bias. So yeah, I think all of these things, it's very hard to understand even what computations the brain is doing, let alone exactly how they're biased. But I think all of these things do apply to the brain as well as neural networks.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know we've talked a lot of like maybe like thought experiments and some really complicated things. So maybe something that's less complicated. What are you doing now? What is your like current work or your current like endeavors, or maybe if you're doing any like work outside, what are you
Yeah.
focused on now?
Right now I'm mostly designing some experiments in you could call it the psychology of neuroscience. So what I'm really interested in understanding is how explanations work in neuroscience. So that's why I think about computation, right? It's how neuroscientists explain the brain. And so I want to understand what exactly they're doing when they use it to explain the brain. And if it's right that the concept of computation is a tool that neuroscientists use when they apply it to the brain to get models of the brain, to generate hypotheses about the brain, to make predictions about the brain and stuff like that, we should be able to look at them in experiments and see what they're able to do with the notion of computation that they can't do without it. So the idea is to run a bunch of experiments on neuroscientists as participants, where they have they're given certain explanations of a system that are like computational or not computational, or ones that involve a certain concept and not other ones, and see what they're actually able to do given those explanations, the different explanations. That's been taking up the most of my time lately because I've been writing a grant to try to get funding for those experiments. Aside from that, I've been working on all this stuff about computation and thinking about other kinds of neuroscientific explanation, and yeah, thinking about computers of all different kinds.
Well, yeah, I mean, that sounds awesome. And also like experiment design sounds pretty fun, but also really grueling with the amount of paperwork and work that goes into like filling out stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's like about like wraps up the entirety of the podcast. Just thanks so much, Dr. Richmond, for your time today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audiences as well. And I will also leave a link to Dr. Richmond's website if you want to go read up any of the papers or like or any of like the research and new research. If you're coming upon this podcast later in the year, there will probably be over there. So yeah, just want to say thank you again for your time.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really fun.